Putin is reaching his culminating point much more quickly than Trump. He's lost, devastating losses in the war, over 1 million men. He's lost strategic military capability deep in Russia, and that even his great spin machine can do nothing except, try and say something that's not happening that actually is happening. And the economy in the position it's in at the moment, with a lot of the rank and file barely able to eat, the rumours of discontent are growing and growing and growing. And if Trump can force oil below $50 a barrel, very quickly, even Putin's war machine is going to run out of money, and he can't run it on thin air. So I hope that his road is a lot shorter than Trump's road.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Hamish De Bretton Gordon, former British Army officer, commander of the Royal Tank Regiment and former commander of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment. Hamish has served on operations from the first Gulf War through to Iraq and Afghanistan, and is very much a friend of the show. Hamish, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Hamish, if Trump's return to the White House upended the security infrastructure here in Europe, he's had the opposite effect in the Asia-Pacific region. Speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Summit in Singapore, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has doubled down on ramping up deterrence against China. Is Trump right to be preparing for a military confrontation in this region?
Well, I think what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, and as you say, Secretary of State Hesketh has just been in Singapore talking. It's rather, we're getting used to this sort of approach from Trump, I think, at the moment. Now, it's pretty clear that Trump's main priorities are in the Far East, and he sees China very much as the threat that the US, as in, US mainland, US central, needs to focus on. He is less concerned with what's happening in Europe and sees Russia less as a threat. Now, this is not surprising because, Trump is the greatest businessman in the world. So he tells us. So I think it is business what this is all about. At the moment, the Chinese economy is just behind the US in terms of scale and size and dollars and yen and everything else. But it's growing at a great rate. And I think Trump sees that, as a direct threat. So I think it's not surprising that his right-hand man is out in that part of the world, reminding people of their responsibilities. And again, telling people they need to up their defence spending. I think he's had a go at the Australians, saying you need to be at 3.5%. This seems to be a figure that's been batted around Europe as well. So it is Trump's policy and his close team to try and make sure that their allies start doing the heavy lifting and get their military into gear. I think it's very, the main area of concern at the moment, stand fast the South China Seas for a moment, but Taiwan. Now, it's well known that the Chinese aspirations on Taiwan, and there's been a lot of rhetoric between Beijing and Washington about this. And it would appear that the President of China has told his military planners to make sure that they're ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan, if necessary, training, equipment, etc., etc. So everything is playing out relatively in the open. And then one's sort of consider, why is Taiwan so important to America? Well, Taiwan is one of the biggest makers of semiconductors, which is essential to virtually everything these days. And it, without being too cynical about it, from a business perspective, this may well be what Trump's looking at here. So I don't think anybody should be too surprised. Of course, here in Europe, we're rather more concerned, about the Russians than the Chinese. And I think with all that's going on in Ukraine and Russia at the very moment, Trump seems to be pretty silenced. And, his team are focused in the Indo-Pacific, which is an area, although I personally think that we in the UK should not be getting involved, and we should be focusing more in Europe. But as we stand, the British fleet is with our very expensive and very powerful aircraft carriers are on their way at this very moment.
And how serious then is the threat to Taiwan from China now? I mean, if China are incited to by this increase in defense push from America, could they take Taiwan as it stands?
Well, I think this is a really interesting dilemma and very, very good question. One could say that the Chinese were galvanized by Russia's land grab into Ukraine. You know, I suppose theoretically and psychologically for similar sort of reasons that China believes that Taiwan is part of China, as Putin believed that Ukraine is or should be part of Russia. And maybe because of the very sort of loose or poor reaction by Trump to what's happening in Ukraine, it's probably encouraged Beijing that actually, yeah, this is the very time to do something, because Trump and the new administration aren't that interested in projecting power, outside mainland USA. However, it would appear, certainly from what Hesketh has been saying this week, that maybe Trump is, that would be a false assumption to make from Beijing, because Trump seems to value Taiwan far more than he does Ukraine. When it comes to military perspective, I think at this very moment the Chinese would be pushed to take Taiwan, but they are building up a force and capability to enable them to do that. And in the background, of course, they're also building up their nuclear capability. Without wanting to go too much into the detail of nuclear, the whole theory behind nuclear deterrence is equilibrium and parity. Now, China, although it is the fastest growing nuclear weapon state in the world, it is vastly overmatched by the Americans. So a factor of 100% sort of thing. So in the background, I'm sure that is part of the metrics that they're thinking about here. So I think as we stand at the moment, China would be pushed to take Taiwan, but they seem to be building military capability that suggests they're really interested in doing it. And on the other side, Trump is trying to counterbalance that, not necessarily by putting more US military capability in the Indo-Pacific, but getting his allies there to up their defense spending exactly the same that he's trying to do to the Europeans, so that he doesn't have to commit so much there either.
And China have responded to Hegseth's announcement. They've accused him of inciting conflict and confrontation and escalating tensions in the region. If you'll allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment here, Hamish, could this in fact be another case of bombastic Trump and his team making claims about a region that they might not understand?
Very, very possibly. I mean, certainly, when we look at the way that they've played the European problems and the Middle East problems, and let's not forget, that crass security breach they had when fairly new in office, they were trying to organise military attacks on the Houthis, and of course told everybody about it and all their secrets as well. You sort of think, crikey, is this the sort of way to try and create peace around the world? So yeah, I think there is that. I mean, I don't want to be as intellectually arrogant enough to suggest that President Trump and his close advisors understand little apart from doing real estate deals. That would be crass. But you do sometimes question the way they go about business, and it's about strategic politics here. It's not about doing some deal about real estate. This is where lives and countries and livelihoods are absolutely at risk. And I think, the rather loose and offhand way that people like Hesketh and others are going about their business is a huge concern. And ambiguity might be good in some places, but it also creates confusion and misunderstanding. And when you get misunderstanding, you get mistakes. And when you get mistakes, when you've got superpowers, abutting each other militarily, that is really dangerous.
Well, Hegseth also discussed in this announcement that the first ever live fire test of the US's mid-range capability system in Australia. He talked about expanding cooperation and joint exercises, establishing new or expanding current repair capabilities and capacity programs in that region. How crucial and what sort of role do all of these programs uh, uh, make for militaries, and what message will that send to China?
Well, I think individually they are interesting, but altogether they're significant. Yeah, I think it sends a very strong message that this is not firing off the hip as apparently it would seem, but there is a plan and there's a long-term plan, and it makes sense, to use Australia in particular as a sort of strategic partner and strategic base. And of course, we're involved in a way with the AUKUS program, which is Australia, the UK, and the US around submarines. And so I think it makes sense, and hopefully, I presume the Trump administration are trying to show they're really serious in the region and build pressure on Beijing so that Beijing realizes that actually, that although they might believe Taiwan should be part of China, a land grab here is really not in their long term interests because the Americans will not allow it to happen. I wouldn't say without a fight, but without a sort of metaphorical and financial fight. I think the physical military fight is still some way off, and I assume that Ethan Hesketh and Trump want to avoid that if at all possible.
And this is all part of in a way, quite consistent global message from the US: ramp up in the Pacific, but at the same time ramp down in Europe. Is Trump right to take this zero-sum game approach to deterring China and Russia?
Well, it's certainly not an approach that we've seen by previous American administrations, and we always claim to be their greatest ally and closest friend. But that is perhaps although President Trump, we understand, still loves us and loves the monarchy and loves British golf courses. He doesn't seem to love us as much as some of the previous presidents and be prepared to commit military capability to protect us and Europe. It is very clear that he sees his main threats coming from the Indo-Pacific, and that's where they're going to focus their might. But it also seems to be the American policy to make sure that the Europeans who he has been pretty rude about, except ourselves, I suppose, that they step up to the plate and spend. And this 3.5% on defence seems to be a unilateral figure, for all American allies across the piece. So, at least in that score, he is being, he is being consistent. But it is pretty clear that the Americans would much prefer to be out of Europe, facing up to Russia, and focus their efforts in the Far East, facing up to the Chinese.
And yeah, you mentioned that 3.5% figure. Hegseth picked out Australia in particular, saying they need to raise their military spending to that figure. Australia are part of that AUKUS deal you mentioned as well. Is he right to pick out Australia as something of a linchpin of defence for the West in the Pacific?
I think he is, absolutely. We have the Five Eyes intelligence community, which is the US, Canada, in inverted commas, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So there is very close intelligence sharing. Australia is very closely aligned to the American military. I went to the Australian Army Staff College, and it more resembled an American staff college than actually a British one. Yeah, everything was focused on sort of American operating procedures. So I think there is a close affinity between those two countries, and I think it makes absolute sense. Strategically, Australia is based in the right place. It's obviously a massive country, but it is it's a key staging point up into the South China Seas and that area. So it makes, to me as a military person, it makes sense for the Americans really to see the Australians as their key partner in that part of the world. They speak the same language, metaphorically and physically. So yeah, I think it's probably a good move by the Americans.
And Hegseth has actually pointed out specifically Europe's commitments to boost spending while speaking to their partners in the Pacific as an example of that America's Pacific allies should follow. Is he right? Is Europe setting a good precedent for others to follow? I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of the UK's strategic defence review, which has come out in the last few days, in part. Is that enough? Has that impressed Trump, do you think? Is that a sign that the Americans think we're doing the right thing?
Well, I think the Americans have certainly, or Trump in particular, has certainly had an impact on Britain's defence capability, and also Europe. I think those European countries closest to the Russians didn't need any poking, and you got the Poles who are spending plus of 4% at the moment, the Latvian states, the Baltic states rather, in that sort of time frame. And even the Germans have suddenly realised that, yeah, crikey, they need to pull weight, and they are potentially spending $200 billion or euros on their defence. So, yeah, I think it's had a huge impact. When it comes to the UK, I am sure Prime Minister Starmer would not say that he has been directed by, some of Trump's bluff and bluster. But you look at the defence review yesterday, and you would have to say, yes, they certainly have. And the lessons learned from Ukraine, the capability that's been suggested, be it submarines, be it cyber command, etc., seems to be all the sort of stuff that Britain would need to fight in a Ukraine-type war. And that's what Trump has been saying. You Europeans, including the Brits, have got to do the heavy lifting yourselves. What is not entirely clear yet is whether Britain is actually going to come up with the 3% or 3.5%. And I think that's really unfortunate, because on the face of this, it's a really good defence review. Looks to be well researched and producing the right capability. And you can just see, Putin and his mates in the Kremlin looking up and thinking, God, crikey, they're getting serious in the UK and Europe. We need to take note. But then to say, well, we'll try and find the money if economic conditions, etc., lie. You can almost see Putin sort of puffing out his chest. Oh, yeah, same old hot air. They talk a good game, but can they actually play it? So I think that is slightly unfortunate, and hopefully confirmation that the money will be available, needs to come and needs to be very public as soon as possible.
And we talk about Russia. Obviously, the war in Ukraine rages on despite Trump's promises to bring it to an end. Trump had said that Zelensky had no cards to play in this war. What message do you think Ukraine's attacks on these strategic bomber bases, and even today on the Kerch bridge, have sent to the White House?
Well, one doesn't want to be, too smart and too clever, and I don't think that's what the Ukrainians are doing. But when it comes to cards to play, I mean, Ukraine has just played 3 or 4 aces. Absolutely incredible operations on Sunday by the SBU, the Ukraine Security Service, conducting operations thousands of miles into Russia and destroying pretty much a key strategic military capability in its long-range jets that fire not only the cruise missiles that are devastating Ukraine, but also carry Putin's tactical nuclear weapons. So I think, and the fact that it's so well planned, undoubtedly a lot of Russians were involved in it as well. It's really a severe cut deep into Russia that even the Russian propaganda spin machine, are actually spinning themselves into a complete, horlicks because there's no way they can say this is anything but a disaster. You add to that the Russian railway bridges and railways being blown up in Western Russia, and then today the Kursk bridge hit yet again. I mean, these are real special operational executive operations of the Second World War, combination of what we would call, special forces, the SAS, and the intelligence services. I think they have been extraordinary and really show that Ukraine can badly hurt Russia. I mean, my final piece on this, looking to the SDR, I am a little bit surprised that this type of capability, we do have it in the UK. We have a very small special forces, and of course, we have a very effective secret intelligence service. I'm surprised that we're not expanding that, because the two most dramatic military events in the last sort of 24 months have been the Ukrainian SBU attack that we've just discussed, and the Israeli Secret Service attack on Hezbollah, blowing up all their pages, which destroyed Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So, it strikes me that in the 21st century, these type of operations that we saw a lot in the Second World War are still very, very prescient, and we should be focusing on.
And meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, the talks on the war that Trump has been pushing for have been continuing in Turkey. Do you think we're seeing enough progress there to appease Trump? I mean, he set this 2-week deadline, one of many, for the Kremlin to do something realistic on the idea of a ceasefire. Are we any further along today?
Well, no, I think yesterday's meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul was a disaster. But I think it was entirely because the Russians have been absolutely humiliated by the attacks in Russia on Sunday, and the peace proposals that the Russians gave to the Ukrainians, which I've written about today extensively, are in effect a surrender document. The Russians are asking the Ukrainians to surrender and, if in effect, become part of Russia. I mean, it is, it shows complete contempt from Russian negotiators for the Ukrainians, to the extent that they also tried to make a joke out of the 300 or so children that the Russians have stolen are currently hiding in Russia. So, yeah, unfortunately, I think yesterday was a disaster. Let's hope when the dust settles, they can get back together and have some meaningful peace talks.
And who do you think is running out of road here, really? I mean, Putin could be facing these pretty significant third-party sanctions that are gaining a lot of momentum in the US, in the legislature, or is Trump kind of the one running out of space here? Because he seems to just be burning up trust in the US as a military ally, at least in Europe.
I think when you look at it in the round, actually, I believe Putin is reaching his culminating point much more quickly than Trump. He's lost, devastating losses in the war, over 1 million men. He's lost strategic military capability deep in Russia, and that even his great spin machine can do nothing except, try and say something that's not happening that actually is happening. And the economy in the position it's in at the moment, with a lot of the rank and file barely able to eat, the rumours of discontent are growing and growing and growing. And if Trump can force oil below $50 a barrel, very quickly, even Putin's war machine is going to run out of money, and he can't run it on thin air. So I hope that his road is a lot shorter than Trump's road.
Well, Hamish De Bretton Gordon, thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
Thank you very much for having me.